Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to our online audience. Welcome to our audience here in the Old Theatre. And welcome, of course, to the panel, who I will introduce in the moment. My name is Tania Burchardt. I'm Associate Director of the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion and an Associate Professor in the Department of Social Policy here at LSE. And I'm delighted to be opening this event on where do we draw the line exploring an extreme wealth line. On my right here, we have Professor Ingrid Robeyns. Here we have Olivier de Schutter, Gary Stevenson, and Fernanda Balata, our distinguished panel. And I will say a little bit more about each one when we take their addresses to us in turn. So the subject of wealth and wealth inequality could hardly be more pressing given global developments. We see before our eyes unfolding some of the impacts that the concentration of wealth can have. And just to remind us the scale of the challenge that we're facing, the recent statistics suggest that the wealthiest 1% of the world own 47.5% of total global wealth. So that's a really extraordinary position to find ourselves in, especially when we consider that at the other end of the spectrum, the bottom 40% of the world's population own less than 1% of the world's wealth. So when we're talking about wealth inequality, it's that kind of scale of difference that we need to keep in mind. Here in the UK, we punch above our weight in contributing to these inequalities, these statistics. If we look at the absolute wealth gap, so the actual amount of pounds in the case of the UK between the wealthiest and the least wealthy, we're second in the OECD, only behind America in terms of the level of wealth inequality in this country. So it's a global problem, but it's also a national problem for us here in the UK. Those are some of the background to what we're going to be discussing today, which is really, will it help us to get a grip on this problem of extreme wealth if we were to have an extreme wealth line, a defined understanding of when wealth becomes too much or when wealth becomes a problem? And that's really the question for us this evening. We'll hear from our panel, and then there'll be a chance for Q&A and discussion, both online and in the room. Those of you who are online, you can start adding your questions to the Q&A whenever you like, using the function at the bottom of your screen. But please remember just to say your name and affiliation when you add your questions. Okay, so first of all, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Ingrid Robeyns, who holds the chair in Ethics of Institutions at the Ethics Institute of Utrecht University. She received her PhD from Cambridge University, where she was supervised by Amartya Sen. And her work focuses on socioeconomic questions in contemporary political philosophy and applied ethics. And she's author of the book Limitarianism, which Ingrid can now wave, yes. And which will form the basis for what Ingrid has to say this evening. Thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you all for, I need to move this. Thank you all for coming tonight and for taking an interest in this topic that obviously I found very important. I will use my 10 minutes to talk to you about the reasons for an extreme wealth line. And basically the reasons for an extreme wealth line is the same questions as why would we bother about, or why would we worry about wealth inequality becoming too big or the concentration of wealth becoming too concentrated at the top end of the scale, obviously. And I will, so indeed, as Tania kindly said, I've written a whole book on this topic. And I'm just going to pick some elements, and I will necessarily have to be brief and somewhat superficial, but if you're interested, you can find all the arguments and also trying to respond to possible objections in the book. So first, before I say something about wealth inequality, I will also give you some data and then go to the reasons. I want to say one sentence about the importance of wealth in people's life. Because people who worry about wealth inequality, they are not anti-wealth. Actually, we are very much pro-wealth, but we're pro-wealth for, you could say, everybody. Why? Because wealth has a different function in people's lives than income. Income we need for our daily, meeting daily needs and so forth. But wealth gives you the opportunity to plan ahead. It gives you the opportunity also to structurally support others. You can set up a business. You can invest in your education. So it plays a very different role in our agency, in what we can do as human beings. And the problem is, of course, if it's so unequally divided, then some people have a lot of that power and others don't have much at all. Now, here are some of the stylized facts. Average wealth has increased significantly. So the world, definitely the global north has become much richer over the last decades, but the inequality has also increased. There are very large inequalities on a global scale. Tania gave you the figures. In the US and Western Europe, we've seen a decrease of wealth inequality after the Second World War until the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, and then it has started to increase again. There are multiple reasons, but one important one is politics. Namely, we've had the so-called neoliberal turn in how we do policy making, which has led to a drastic reduction of the highest tax rates, more possibilities for people with assets and wealth to avoid paying taxes and so forth. Now, this is basically the wealth distribution in Europe. I'm using this source, which is the USB Global Wealth Report, the latest one that is available. Since last year, they no longer want to share their data. But the reason I'm using this data rather than, say, for example, from the World Inequality Lab in Paris is that it distinguishes between the 1% and the 5%. So basically what we see here again is that half of the population has virtually no wealth. That to me is a very striking fact. That means it's not just like you could say people who just turned 18 who may not have much wealth, but it's half of the population. So that means a very large, well, half of the people basically have no buffer. The next 40% has 31% of wealth, so they have at least something that is roughly equal. But the real concentration is in the richest 10%. 10% of Europeans have 2/3 of all the wealth. And if you go further into zooming in into the top 5%, they hold half of it. And the top 1% have 30%. So that's a huge concentration. It's not just so what we know between the global north and the global south, but it's also within countries that wealth inequality is, well, I would think, staggeringly large. And then you have, of course, absolute numbers at the top of the billionaire pyramid. I think you could just speak of hyperwealth. This I copy-pasted from the real-time billionaires list from the Forbes website. So these are data from today. Elon Musk today has assets equal to $351 billion. I don't know whether your brain can process this. My brain can't. So what you can best do is to just take the price of an average house in the place where you live and calculate how many houses the equivalent would be of Elon Musk's wealth. And then you get a sense of how much that is. So that just means, and we've seen recently over the last 2 months, what that wealth does in a democracy like the US. I don't need to explain this. Now, how come that inequality has increased so much? There's a fantastic report by Gabriel Zuckman in which he proposed a global wealth tax on billionaires. This was commissioned by Brazil in the context of the G20. And what you see here, and you have to be careful at the right-hand side, it's not just deciles, it then turns into smaller units. But what you basically see is that in those 4 countries, taxation, this is all tax forms together, it's not really progressive. In fact, in many countries, including France, Italy, and definitely also the Netherlands, where I come from, it is regressive. The richest people have a lower average tax burden than the middle classes, and often the poor are even not, they also have to pay the same tax burden as others, of course, in comparison with income. But that means that image that we have of ourselves, that the strongest shoulders carry the highest burdens, I think is it's clear that this is can be denied. Now, what I try to do in this book is I try to give us reasons why wealth inequality and the concentration is undesirable. And then I defend this idea that I call limitarianism, which is there should be a cap to how much wealth a person can have. I don't talk about company wealth, but I do talk about personal wealth. Of course, these two are related, and we can talk about it in the Q&A if you want. What are those reasons? There are many. Each of those reasons is a chapter in the book, I'm sorry to say, so I will only be able to touch upon some. But first, historically, much of the wealth that is in the hand of very rich people is tainted. It's related to either environmental damage, or it's tied to practices of slavery. So people should not have had that wealth in the first place, and processes of rectification have not taken place. Secondly, there's a standard, what we call utilitarian or welfarist argument, that nobody needs so much money for their standard of living. In fact, I collaborated with quantitative economic sociologists a couple of years ago. We did a study in the Netherlands where we asked people, how much do you think if you have a certain quality of life, at what point do you think it just doesn't add to your quality of life? And we found for price levels of 2018, that a family of 4, if they had 2.2 million euros, that at that point, most people turn it around. So that's why in the book I propose, if you have 1 million euros or pounds, because it's really, we can't give it a number that's so detailed that it makes a difference whether we look at euros or pounds, you seem to have like all you can have in terms of a standard of living. Of course, that means that if that wealth were much more redistributed, we could do lots of good things in meeting urgent needs, lifting the poor out of poverty, but also guaranteeing general equal opportunities rather than having merely formal opportunities, and also addressing lots of unmet needs that are spread throughout the population, for example, mental health issues. The third reason I will just mention, because if you've been reading the newspapers, I don't need to explain this anymore. Extreme wealth concentration undermines democracy. Basically, in the US, the government is now sort of in the hands of the billionaires. I'm happy to defend that claim if you disagree. The fourth reason is that extreme wealth is incompatible with economic sustainability. And this is, again, all these claims are at population level. What we see at population level is that the 1% globally has an average greenhouse gas footprint of 101 tons CO2 emissions, whereas in Africa, most areas in Africa, people have 1 ton. In Europe, we're around 6. So you can't have the lifestyles that come with those fortunes. And there are studies done that if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions of the billionaires, they go up to, say, 8,000 tons per person per year, which is just unsustainable. The fifth reason is a philosophical reason, which is nobody deserves to be super rich. So, of course, this is what neoliberalism teaches us, that all of us can become super rich. I review all sorts of reasons why luck plays a much more important role in our lives than we are willing to generally admit. But if luck plays such a big role, it implies that we cannot take credit if we are super successful financially. I do think that some inequalities can be justified, but not this level. And finally, there is an argument which I think is somewhat more shaky on empirical grounds, which is that one might argue extreme wealth concentration is not good for the super rich themselves, because they would also lead better lives in more secure societies where they also have more shared public goods. So these are some of the reasons why I think extreme wealth concentration is morally and politically and societally undesirable, and why we should really start to investigate this idea that at some point it's enough and that we have an extreme wealth line. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ingrid. I'd next like to introduce Olivier de Schutter, who is a UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, appointed by the Human Rights Council in March 2020. He's also a professor of law at UCLouvain and at SciencesPo in Paris, and he's also a member of the Global Law School faculty at New York University. Very much, Olivier.
Thank you very much, Tania, for this introduction, and many thanks to Ingrid for having so superbly opened our discussion. It may be a bit strange that the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights speaks about extreme wealth. But the two, in fact, are closely connected. The extreme concentration of wealth we are witnessing today has, in my view, three major drawbacks that have an impact on the ability for governments to combat poverty and on people in poverty to overcome the predicament that they are facing. Firstly, it's important to remember that part of the reasons why people in poverty do not escape easily from their condition is because of the obstacles they face, having fewer social networks on which to rely, having less an ability to risk starting a business, having no ability to wait for the right opportunity to arise before making certain choices in life, for example, reasons that Ingrid has briefly alluded to. There is, according to many studies, an inverse relationship between inequalities and social mobility. In other terms, the more a society is unequal, the less people have a chance to overcome their class disadvantage. Economists call this the Great Gatsby Curve, and they base this denomination on the famous novel by Francis Scott Fitzgerald that describes the story of this bootlegger in New York that succeeds in New York society despite the odds that were against him at the start of his life. But of course, Gatsby is the exception to the rule. Most people who are raised in poverty, who have a low-income background, do not succeed easily in life. So that's the first reason why we should all be concerned about the rise of inequalities or the inability for governments to tackle it. The second reason why this is important is that in our market economy, people in poverty will be priced out of certain goods when very rich people can put lots of money on the table in the auctioning process that, in fact, the market is about. And that is, for example, why in a town such as Brussels or a city such as London, housing costs make it unaffordable for people in poverty to choose where to live and thereby to have more employment opportunities and have access to education or healthcare in the right conditions. They simply are priced out from the ability to pay the high rents because there are very rich people out there that can pay the high rents. And so in societies such as ours, where most social goods are the result of an auctioning process so that the richest with the deepest pockets can can have access to these resources, others will be deprived of those same these same resources as a result. So that's the second reason why there is a relationship between extreme concentration of wealth and the perpetuation of poverty. The third concern, again, one Ingrid has alluded to, is that from the ecological point of view, extreme inequalities and extreme concentration of wealth are problems. And the first reason for this is that a society that has scarce resources it must spend on certain priorities will make a very inefficient use of these resources if very rich people can command control over the resources because of their ability to spend. And so we are in a society that will continue to build mansions for the very rich, very powerful cars, private jets, whereas at the same time, people queue for years before they can have access to social housing and are unable to afford transportation from where they live to where they work. And that is simply unacceptable. But it is the result of a society spending its resources on what people who are rich have an ability to pay for. So the argument I try to make in a report I presented to the United Nations on how to eradicate poverty without growth is an argument based in part on the idea that if we tolerate high levels of inequalities, we can continue to grow. If that growth continues to be used to cater to the frivolous desires of the ultra-rich, the basic needs of people in poverty will be neglected at the same time. Moreover, we know that the highest income earners and the wealthiest people are responsible for much higher levels of greenhouse gas emissions that are heating the planet today. In fact, since 1990, 23% of the rise in greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to the 1% richest people in society, whereas the 50% poorest worldwide are responsible only for 16% of that rise in greenhouse gas emissions. And most of this carbon footprint of the ultra-rich people is in the financial investments that they make. They basically feed the financialization of the economy that is responsible for the way the economy is contributing to climate change. Moreover, and that is the third connection between huge inequalities and the pressures on the environment, the lifestyles of the ultra-rich are completely unsustainable. Lucas Chancel, who is part of the World Inequality Lab that Ingrid referred to, made those calculations showing that the 10% wealthiest people on the planet are responsible for 36 to 45% of total greenhouse gas emissions. And the problem is not only that they have a huge impact on greenhouse gas emissions, it's also that the lifestyles that they have and that we are advertised and manufactured to desire are becoming the model that everyone is meant to emulate. And that is extremely problematic, that people, wherever they find themselves on the social ladder, try to mimic those unsustainable lifestyles that are tolerated in our societies. So how to address this problem? Well, I'm extremely grateful to Fernanda Balata from the New Economics Foundation for having made these proposals about establishing an extreme wealth line. And indeed, I'm very grateful to the team at the New Economics Foundation for all their work on these issues over the years. There are, it seems to me, two ways to build on what they did and to make very concrete policy proposals based on the concerns that they expressed. The first one is to put pressure on governments so that inheritance is taxed at a higher level. I was very surprised to discover when I did a report for the UN on the perpetuation of poverty from one generation to the next, that in many OECD countries, there was no tax on inheritance. In fact, there's a tax on inheritance in 24 out of, in 24 out of 37 OECD countries, there is no tax on inheritance whatsoever. And even in the dozen countries of the OECD that have an inheritance tax, the inheritance tax is very low. It contributes to 0.5% of total public revenue in these countries. And in a country such as the US, you can give to your children, and the children can inherit from you if you die, up to $11 million without paying any tax whatsoever. That is deeply problematic. It's one of the major reasons for the perpetuation of poverty and privilege in our societies. And indeed, the 20% richest people in Europe and the US receive 50 times more in gifts and inheritance from their parents than the 20% poorest people in these regions. So that is a major problem. And of course, again, as Ingrid was mentioning, there is no relationship whatsoever between deserved merit that we may wish to reward in our ideal of a meritocratic society on the one hand, and inheriting from your parents on the other hand. So that's one option, to tax inheritance at a higher level and with a progressive tax rate. The other option is, of course, to tax the billionaires on their wealth. And yes, at the request of the Brazilian presidency of the G20, the French economist Gabriel Zucman provided some calculations and suggestions. Just one figure: if you impose a 2% tax on the wealth of the 3,000 billionaires, the richest people on earth, you could raise around $250 billion US. And $250 billion US is more than 2/3 what is needed to finance social protection across all low-income countries. The 26th poorest countries on earth, representing some 720 million people, 9% of the world's population, would be covered by social protection if only we taxed billionaires with a 2% tax on their wealth. And to me, as Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, it is very striking that we are not making progress in establishing social protection floors for the poorest people on earth, despite it being so easy to identify where we can tax wealth in order to make that difference in poor people's lives. So these options, taxing inheritance or taxing the billionaires, present another advantage. It is that we don't need, if we tax wealth, to tax as much work and income that people make through work as we do today. Today, one major problem governments face is that in order to finance social protection, public services, healthcare, education, they need to tax economic activity. And so they need to grow the economy infinitely in order to be able to continue to provide services to their population. But if you tax wealth, you don't need to grow the economy. You just ensure that the wealthiest people contribute to financing the public policies for which the state is responsible. Now, in theory, that should work. In practice, there are two major obstacles that we encounter, and I will close by recalling what these obstacles are. The first one is the ability for the richest people to block change. The richest in society have a huge ability to convert their economic power into political influence. And an economist from the University of Chicago, Luigi Zingales, calls this the cycle of the Medici, in which you use your money to buy political influence, and then you use your political influence to make money, And this is exactly what we're seeing today with the Trump administration. But that's not the only link between wealth and inequalities on the one hand and the capture of the political system on the other hand. There are two other links. The second link is that in societies that are deeply unequal, people at the bottom of the social ladder, people who are poor, who feel left out, are less incentivized to invest in public action. They put less energy in civic participation because they do not feel that the system is working for them. And so they don't vote, they're not interested in politics. And as a result, politics caters more to the expectations of the richest segments of society. And moreover, and that is a third connection that you see in a country such as this one, the UK, the more people are left out from the general progress, the more they're tempted to vote for the radical right. I'm now preparing a report for the Council of Europe on the reasons why the radical right is emerging in recent elections. I see the polls like you do. The latest poll for the UK shows that Reform UK is attracting 26% of the voters, more than Labour, more than the Conservatives, the Labour being just above the Conservatives, as you know. And that is extremely worrying. Why do so many people now express an interest for Reform UK? Well, because they are not benefiting from general progress. And this is also what we see in Germany with the recent legislative elections. Alternative für Deutschland, 21% of the votes nationwide, mostly in Eastern Germany, because people feel left out. So if we don't do more to combat inequalities and give hopes to people in poverty, we will see the radical right continue to rise, and that will make reform even more difficult to achieve. And then the second and final obstacle is the lack of international cooperation. At least that is what we often hear from politicians. They say, well, we would like to do more, but if we tax corporations at a higher rate, if we tax the ultra-rich at a confiscatory rate, they will locate their assets elsewhere and they will evade taxation. However, whilst there may be some truth to this with respect to corporations, who may choose where to register and thus where to be domiciled and which nationality they acquire. And of course, they choose where to declare their profits in order to pay in low tax jurisdictions. That we know is their sport. This does not work for individuals. Individuals have a nationality that they do not decide on. And the richest British nationals may choose to reside in the Bahamas or in Panama. They will still be Brits and they can still be taxed by the Treasury of the UK. So there is no obstacle in principle to taxing the rich wherever they choose to go and however much they try to hide their assets. What is true is that having access to the information requires cooperation between jurisdictions. This is in part what the UN Convention on Taxation, which is under negotiation, is trying to overcome. That is the obstacle, but there's no legal obstacle to taxing the rich wherever they may wish to reside. So this is just a long way of expressing my gratitude to the New Economics Foundation for their important work on this topic. And I very much hope that in the next few years, the pressure will continue to mount on governments so that at last they take seriously this challenge to the social fabric. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olivier. It was, again, very thought-provoking and interesting to set the extreme wealth in the context of extreme poverty and think about the relationship between those two. I turn now to Gary Stevenson, who walked away from a very successful career as a trader in the city and decided to turn his skills and attention to tackling inequality, economic inequality, has worked with a number of different economic think tanks, has set up his own YouTube channel. You can probably tell us how many followers there are now on the channel, Gary's Economics, which sets out to explain everyday economics in accessible terms to the general public. Gary also published last year his book, The Trading Game, A Confession, which I thoroughly recommend as a great read. Gary, over to you.
When I first heard of this idea, extreme wealth line, I thought, yeah, that's a good idea. I thought, I'm not sure if it'll catch on, but if you could have the super rich holding less, then you could have the rest of us holding more. And you could have ordinary families owning their own homes again, maybe, without a massive mortgage, and maybe having a little bit of passive income, and maybe not having to worry about paying the bills every month. But then I thought, well, I would say that because I'm an inequality campaigner, and that's not much of a surprise, really. So I tried to think of what would 12-year-old Gary have thought, you know, what would 15-year-old Gary have thought, what would 19-year-old Gary have thought. And it's interesting to have this conversation in this room today, because on a day like today, 19-year-old Gary would have been having a maths lecture in this room. I've been in this room probably 100 times. Had a lot of my lectures here when I was undergrad. But I was never in this room for an event like this. Every time I was in this room, it was for a lecture, or maybe a revision lecture, or if I was feeling extra spicy, it might have been for a finance society event. But I never used to come to events like this, because I didn't come to LSE to reduce inequality. Let's be honest, most people don't. I came to LSE to get rich, which is what most people do. And through coming to LSE, I was able to get a job as a trader in the city, as some of you might know, my backstory. And I always remember, so I started working as a trader in June 2008, which was just before the credit crisis, the Lehman crisis. And I remember just after the Lehman crisis, there was a budget, something like a budget. And I think it was Gordon Brown, it might have been Alistair Darling. He was standing up there and he was going to say, oh, what we're going to do to fix this, we're going to tax the bankers. We're going to tax the bankers. And at the time, I was a banker, and I was living with my mum and my dad and my brother and my sister in a tiny little terraced house in Ilford, East London, next to the railway. And I was sharing a bunk bed with my brother. And I used to shower in this little plastic bath with this shower that you plugged into the taps. And I was surrounded by these millionaires, and I wasn't a millionaire. And I was watching this budget, and they were saying, we're going to tax the bankers. And I was thinking, are we allowed to swear in this event?
Best not.
I was thinking, that's a shame. Because I worked really hard to get onto that trading floor. And everyone around me was a rich man. They were mostly men. But I wasn't rich yet. So sometimes I worry with messages like this, especially when the messages look like they've had a comfy life. How do they land with the 19-year-olds and the 15-year-olds and the 22-year-olds with their plug-in shower heads and their plastic bathtubs? Does it feel like I've had mine and you can't get yours? And I don't think it is that. I don't think it is that because, you know, I understand that if you stop the very rich from owning everything, that means that the poor can get something. I understand that. I understand that. But I think it's very, very important whenever you talk about this, that's front and center. That's front and center. I want to talk about a little bit about how I came to become an inequality campaigner, right? Because my job was basically betting on the recovery of global economies from 2008 financial crisis. And I studied here at LSE, as I've said, with all of the genius rich kids from across the world that are here, as I'm sure any of you who study here will know. And then I went to work on the trading floor with all of the genius rich kids who work on the trading floors. LSE students will know about that. And I saw them predict a recovery in 2009, that didn't happen. And in 2010, that didn't happen. At the beginning of 2011, they were going to say, this year, we're going to have a massive recovery. And I started to become a little bit suspicious that maybe these genius rich kids weren't such geniuses after all. And I wanted to understand why the recovery didn't happen. And we've probably got some economic students here. People will understand. The theory is low interest rates, quantitative easing, massive fiscal stimulus, supposed to get people spending. And then it wasn't happening. So I decided this genius idea. I once proposed it to an economist and he said, that's not what we do. I thought I'd ask people why they weren't spending money. And if you've never done it, I strongly recommend it. Because what people will tell you, 9 out of 10, is we don't have any extra money. We spend everything we get. We're spending out what comes in. But I didn't just take their word for it. I had a little dig in to their financial situation. And back then in the mid-2010s, I was in my mid-20s. What I saw was a generation, my parents' generation, of, to be honest, poor people. My parents were poor people who owned property, poor people who owned wealth. And beneath them, a generation, my generation, of, you know, I went to LSE, you know, richer kids who would never own property because they could never afford it. What you see in there is the loss of the wealth of the middle class. And that was the beginning of 2011, which some of you will recognize as the year of the European sovereign debt crisis. And that was the year that it became clear that not only were ordinary families losing their wealth, but governments were losing their wealth. But it's impossible, right? Either the private sector and the public sector cannot both lose their wealth at the same time, unless there's been like an earthquake, which there hadn't been. So we need to understand where the wealth has gone. And, you know, I didn't have to look far. I was sitting on a trading floor surrounded by millionaires. You know, these things are connected. It's not even an abstract economic way. The wealth that used to be owned by people like my dad, by governments like the British government, the Belgian government, you know, the American government, is owned by billionaires now. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. The most amazing thing I've ever seen in my whole life was in the first year of COVID, that we knew governments across the world would give out trillions of pounds and dollars. Total UK government deficit, £1 trillion. Total US, I think, is now $14 trillion. Nobody asked who's going to get $14 trillion richer. I've never seen anything more amazing than that in my whole life. It was unbelievable. And then the richest people in the world immediately got trillions and trillions of dollars richer. And it immediately caused a cost of living crisis for ordinary people. How could that not have been caught in advance? The reason that it wasn't caught in advance is because economists all over the world, including places like this, simply do not realize that if the rich get enormously richer, if the rich are getting richer at 5, 10, 15% a year in economies that are growing at 1, 2, 3% a year, they are taking your wealth. That is what is happening. That is why ordinary families who used to own property, their kids can't own property. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that in my mind. But listen, we're sitting here beginning of 2025. We have just seen an American president win an election, supported by a huge number of poor people on the campaign promise of slashing taxes for rich people. We have not made that message clear enough. We have not made it clear to ordinary people that if the rich are getting rich at 10, 15, 20%, they are taking your wealth. That is what is happening. It doesn't come out of nowhere. This wealth is it used to be your wealth. It used to be middle-class wealth. It used to be working-class wealth. So, you know, I commend Ingrid very much, and I commend Fernanda for writing these. Yeah, the rich shouldn't be owning everything, because if they do own everything, they will eat us alive, and they are eating us alive. And my friends will never own property because the properties that used to be owned by their parents are owned by the rich now. But it has to be front and center. We cannot allow political parties to win elections based on promises of we're going to slash taxes for the rich. We can't allow that. And when that happened, you know, there was the famous mini budget here, the Liz Truss mini budget, where she promised to slash taxes on rich people. For me, I considered that, and I still do consider that, a personal failure. That's my failure. If we live in a world where ordinary people think that slashing taxes on the rich will benefit their living standards, that is a failure of all of us. All of us. And I know there are people here who work in the industry of trying to influence the public. Well, you failed. We need to influence the public. When people hear this line, I don't want them to think what 15-year-old me thought, which was, what about my share? I want them to think, that's me getting my share back. But it has to be ordinary people, ordinary families, front and center, getting their wealth back, because I don't want to lose any more elections.
Thank you very much indeed, Gary. So now our final speaker, Fernanda Balata, who is a senior political economist at the New Economics Foundation and author of the 2025 report, Exploring an Extreme Wealth Line, which is Fernanda's going to share some of the findings from. Fernanda leads NEF's international programme on extreme wealth and economic justice in collaboration with a network of partners in the Global South and the Global North. Over to you, Fernanda.
Thank you, Tania, and thank you very much for the speakers for sharing the stage with me. I'm very excited to be speaking alongside Ingrid, Olivier, and Gary, and you set me up very well. So I'm going to talk about the research we've done, exploring an extreme wealth line. Just to say that although I really appreciate recognition for the research that I have been involved with the team at the New Economics Foundation, this is not my project. This is very much a collaborative effort of different organizations and individuals, and build on the back of a lot of work out there of people that have been looking around those issues and trying to identify solutions. So I want to start by saying that if we do agree that extreme wealth is an eroding force in society, then, and I think other speakers have said that, we are not actively trying to tackle the risks that it poses. On the contrary, we have a set of social norms, policies, laws, and our economy all being designed to sustain it. So if we want to change this picture that have been very well set by the speakers, we need better tools and metrics to help get us there. So what if we could, and this is the question that we set out to answer, what if we could establish the point at which too much wealth concentrated in too few hands has direct negative effects on democracy, social cohesion, the media, the law, the economy, equality, climate, nature. And importantly, because that's the bit that I'm most interested in, even before you arrive at a metric, what happens when you just pose that question? So that's what we set out to do. First, to say that we interviewed 25 people and 10 political figures and policy experts and 15 millionaires. And we asked that question: They came from Brazil, France, Italy, South Africa, the UK, and the USA. We asked them different questions and we translated those insights into guiding notes and considerations for how the extreme wealth line could be developed, which is in the report. And those interviews took place between September and December last year. Now, we wanted to understand first, what were participants' attitudes towards extreme wealth? Do they consider it to be a problem in society? Do they think that it poses risks to society, and in what ways? When you begin to ask those questions, you get a complex picture. Some participants emphasize that wealth may be used for good, often referring to examples from philanthropy. We heard Bill Gates quite a lot. But the overwhelming sentiment was that its extreme concentration is intrinsically harmful. We also heard, and this has been mentioned about tax on inherited wealth, we heard about the moral implications of inherited wealth, and from a heir who told me that it's unjust because it's just not based on merit, it's a handover. And we heard about the role of extreme wealth in supporting harmful colonial legacies and racial inequalities, in particular from people speaking from the Global South, eroding social trust, breeding resentment between individuals and communities, and causing climate and environmental collapse because of greed, a culture of sacrificing the planet for profit. But across the board, extreme wealth was viewed as a systemic failure. And there was broad agreement that extreme wealth is immoral, while so many people lack their basic necessities and a dignified life, as Olivier put in his work with extreme poverty. One participant's quote, I put it up there, to me illustrates quite well the interplay between the different sentiments towards extreme wealth. It points out that philanthropy, which is often seen as a benevolent force in society, it is an undemocratic means of resource allocation. Because in a democratic system, public resources should be allocated based on collective decision-making. Now, then we moved on to ask participants about how they would go about setting an extreme wealth line, getting them to consider how and where to draw the line. And various factors came out of that conversation, whether wealth was expendable, reasonable, and fair, as well as the type and level of harm that it caused. Now, while participants expressed the importance of accounting for local contexts, there was broad support for a global benchmark for clarity and coordination, and to help address some of the challenges that Olivier posed around tax evasion and capital flight risks. A key challenge is how we consider the widespread notion that Gary very much told us about, that wealth is a symbol of success in our society. Rather than imposing absolute restrictions on wealth accumulation, the majority of participants we interviewed favored using the line to implement redistributive measures like taxation, and just really using it as a tool to talk about how we can build a fairer society, as opposed to being a punitive measure. Now to the bit that might interest some people, where did they actually set the line? Now, nearly half participants, mostly millionaires, suggested an absolute value ranging from 10 million to 1 billion. That's quite a big range. Politicians and policy experts overwhelmingly preferred a relative measure, such as the extent of the wealth gap or a ratio between individual wealth and the size of the national economy. They emphasize more the inequality gap aspect. Now, 1/3 of millionaires set it at 10 million. And one millionaire told me, of the ones that put it at 30 million, that if you have that, you've won capitalism. So this is another quote from one of the interviews on how they went about thinking how one would set the line. Now, I'm going to talk about the benefits of an extreme wealth line. So throughout our discussions in the interviews, and obviously all the work that New Economics Foundation and others have been doing in this space, we think there's a lot of potential for the extreme wealth line as a tool, not just as a metric, that actually sets a number, but as a tool to raise public awareness of the systemic risks of extreme wealth, a tool to help reframe narratives towards building a fairer economy and society. And although participants favored using the line to implement redistributive measures such as taxation, as I mentioned, our analysis do suggest that the extreme wealth line might provide a more powerful foundation for challenging the current primacy of economic growth in our economies, because it would get us to discuss how much growth, at what cost, and for whom. And by providing a benchmark metric, the extreme wealth line can also be used to change public and institutional behavior and processes. So many mentioned the living wage campaign and how, although that's not a enforceable, policy or law, obviously you've seen a movement of many organizations supporting it. And also more effective policy making and for assessing policy impact, because it would trigger actually more work to collect the data that we need to really understand the challenge and help act on it. Now, possible ways forward. So what are the next steps for the initiative? We need more evidence gathering, research and analysis that can explore clear and practical thresholds. We also need to work with institutions and policymakers to place the risks posed by extreme wealth and the need to address them at the center of the inequalities agenda, but at the center of any agenda right now, to save really our objective of having a greater, more democratic and fairer society. And explore the different ways that the extreme wealth line can be used as a tool for more public dialogue about wealth accumulation, distribution, and its impacts in society. So my final two messages are drawing a poverty line or an extreme wealth line. Both have the potential to be highly contested, but it can also be hugely impactful. And it's a worth pursuit, in my opinion, because it enables us as a society to discuss and reassess our tolerance for inequities and ultimately shape better social norms and design better policies to tackle the harms and the risks of structural inequalities. And it's urgent that we do it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. And what a rich range of perspectives we've had presented to us on the panel, from thinking about the different types of harm that extreme wealth might cause: democratic, environmental, societal, economic harms, from the relationship between extreme wealth and entrenching poverty, but also the way in which it may impact the working and middle classes, not just the extremely poor, to some very practical suggestions about how we move from a debate about the harms of extreme wealth into concrete policy suggestions via the mechanism of an extreme wealth line. So now over to you, online audience and audience in the room, for your chance to share your perspectives and views. I can see lots of hands going up. That's terrific. I'm going to take them in rounds of 3 and please wait for the microphone to come to you, and please indicate who you are, and if you're from LSE or from elsewhere, let us know that as well. Okay, lovely. So there's somebody in the middle here with glasses, and then the person next to you in a black jacket. Thank you. We'll take those two first.
Hello, I'm not from LSE, I'm from SOAS, and I'm a language student, so this is a little bit over my head. But my one thought is, what are the arguments against? Obviously, apart from the rich wanting to keep their wealth, why isn't Keir Starmer and the Labour government, I only know about English politics, sorry, why aren't they jumping on this idea? Like, why isn't this a brilliant idea for redistributing wealth?
Thank you very much. So what are the arguments against an extreme wealth line? Yep.
I'm Tom and I'm from King's down the road. This question's mainly for Fernanda, and it's not a very technical question, but I was just interested if any of the millionaires you interviewed mentioned a extreme wealth line below their current level of wealth.
Thank you. And then I think there was a hand just behind, was there? Raise your hand again, your purple top. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dan. I went to Durham to study economics. My question is kind of related to what Olivier was talking about, how if you were to tax all billionaires around 2%, it would cover, I think, something around like social security for a significant proportion of the global poor. My question around how is more around like practically how you actually go about that, because most of those billionaires, I'm assuming, are going to be in the north and probably in the west as well. And then how are you then going to distribute that to significant proportions of the world which maybe don't have billionaires, particularly when foreign aid hasn't really empirically been proven to be particularly effective at improving growth or other kind of economic indicators?
Thank you very much. Okay, panel. So arguments against the extreme wealth line, one specifically for you, Fernanda, on whether anybody set the line below their own level of wealth, and then how the proposal to tax billionaires would actually translate into social protection for you, Olivier. Fernanda, should we start with you?
Yeah, so on your question, Tom, I didn't ask how much what their wealth was. I knew that they were, past the million, but so I wouldn't know. But I was asking that myself as well, so it's a fair question. On the barriers, I guess the backlash. I mean, to me, and I spoke to that. I think the biggest thing that we need to tackle is this, culture that we all. I mean, I grew up in Brazil. I'm from Brazil, and people there are just like it's what Gary was talking to. I mean, it is because. It is the way right now that our system works that, you need to want to be rich and wealthy in order to have financial security. So if that's the way that the economy is telling you it is, then how are you, so that's why I'm interested in the line as this tool to open up that discussion, so yeah, that's.
Yeah, I can only really take the first one, but it's something I think about a lot. Why aren't Labour trying to tax wealth? Why aren't Labour trying to tax the rich? I've got a video on exactly this. Why we don't tax the rich? But there's a few things going on at the same time, right? Which is obviously in this country specifically, the current Labour Party was like very aggressively wanted to like separate itself from the Corbyn brand. So this like becomes like very much like we're not going to tax. We're not going to tax. They obviously went to the election like very aggressively. They were being attacked. You're going to raise taxes. They're like, we're not going to raise taxes. We're not going to raise taxes. But weirdly, like they ruled out all these taxes. But wealth tax is like probably the one tax which is kind of broadly popular. But they ruled it out as well. I think you need to understand. Economists, very few economists think that inequality is like an economic problem. They think of it as like a kind of like an ethical, moral problem. And basically, they're wrong. It's as simple as that. That's why their predictions are wrong all the time. That's why I'm a multimillionaire and they're not. They're just wrong on this, right? It's as simple as that. Like this is the problem. But the problem you have is when we have those discussions, like, there's an element of society, like a group of society where these discussions are had, right? Which is politicians, academics, think tankers, the donors have a little bit of a say, right? These influential people, all of their dads are rich. Every single one of them. It's as simple as that. And they've studied it. The theory says it doesn't matter. The theory is wrong. And they want to believe that. They want to believe that. Like at the end of the day, these decisions are made by rich people, and that's the reason why I have a YouTube channel that talks to the public. Because the fact is, you know, it's 1%, it's like 0.1% of society, which is all rich, that is making these decisions. And if an economic crisis is a crisis of inequality, then those guys are benefiting from it. So I don't think it's corruption. It's a mixture of like greed and stupidity, which holds this back. But the fact is, it works for them. It works for the, you know, Keir Starmer, he will fail on the economy and he will go on to be a very rich man, just like Rishi Sunak, just like Boris Johnson, just like David Cameron, just like Theresa May, just like Gordon Brown, just like they don't get punished for it. It's ordinary people that get punished for it. So unfortunately, if we want this change to happen, it needs to come from a real groundswell of popular support, because basically every single decision maker in this game has a rich dad, and they're winning.
Olivier.
Yes, well, thank you for the very practical question about the tax on the billionaires. The situation is that we have a large number of people in the world who have no social protection whatsoever. About 48% of the world's population has no social protection, and the 52% who do have some level of social protection, it's often very minimalistic and not adequate at all in developing countries. And there's a big debate that has been launched since after the great financial crisis of 2009 as to how we can improve that. And the ILO has calculated the funding shortfall that low-income countries in particular face. How to fund this? The shortfall is about $308 billion per year for those 26 poor countries, together some 720 million people. ODA, Official Development Assistance, will not suffice. Today, the total ODA in the world in 2023 was $233 billion, which is below the 308 billion which would be required. And so the question is, where would the money come from? And there are different financing options that are explored, including the tax on billionaires, that should be treated as a tool to increase international solidarity in favor of low-income countries, because there are various pledges to support them in establishing social protection floors. And the amounts we need to raise to allow this to happen are not affordable for those low-income countries, because their GDP is just too small and the demands are high and their ability to meet that demand limited. But the international community can achieve this. And that was the spirit of the proposals made by Gabriel Zucman to the G20 at the request of the Brazilian presidency. It is a way to build a global public good, which is the fight against poverty. That said, I agree with you that we need to build a case for this international solidarity to be further strengthened at a time when all countries, and not least the UK, are cutting down on their commitments to ODA, in part because other priorities, including national defense, are emerging. So it's not an easy sell. And I don't want to use the demagogic argument that if you have countries that fail, these countries will breed terrorism or will result in migrants arriving in Europe, although some could make those arguments. I think we need to realize that it's a very good investment to combat poverty, because all the households we remove from poverty and all the kids we protect from poverty will in the future contribute to the prosperity of all. But that is not an argument for international solidarity, which I agree is still a case that must be made.
Thank you. Ingrid.
Yes, perhaps I can just say something in response to the first question about why is this not picked up? Well, I think that's an excellent question. But I think what we need to realize is that we, as I pointed out when I talked about how the inequality has been first went down after the war and then started rising again, we've had a shift in the what I don't want to use in a, well, let me just say the word, in ideology. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I mean that just as a set of ideas ideas of human nature, ideas of society that are dominant. That's the way scientists use this. And the ideology that is now dominant is what cultural scholars call neoliberalism. Neoliberalism can be seen as a set of policies, for example, tax reduction, global opening up global markets, all sorts of practical policies, but it's also a set of ideas. And indeed, one of those ideas is the idea that the sky is the limit, and that should be a value or an aspiration in a society. If that is your societal ideal, well, it goes against this idea that at some point you should say it should be enough. So I also think we have, and I agree totally with what Gary says, that wealth concentration and inequality are problems for the economy, but it is also a moral problem. So I don't think it's either or. And I do think we are in a deep existential crisis objectively, if you look at the capture of democracy, if you look at climate change and so on, but we are also really in a crisis of our shared moral norms within countries and globally. And I think that this explains in part why it's the idea that at some point we have enough. There are plenty of people who endorse this, but that it's not the dominant idea. But I'm optimistic that we are hitting a wall and that it's going to change.
I think we have some questions online. Yeah.
Excellent. So I've just got 2 questions. Firstly, how do we shift the narrative to confront the belief that we should all be striving to be rich? And how do we build general public understanding of the distinction between taxing wealth and taxing income? Secondly, we got a question from Tom in sixth form. Question for Gary. Do you ever see an end to wealth inequality in the UK? Is there a policy or group of policies that could have a meaningful effect?
Okay, thank you. Gary, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure.
Best
Should have
directly
got
to
some
you.
paper. It's getting worse. At the moment, it's getting worse. There's no doubt about it. And it's getting worse like pretty quickly. I actually think we have a good chance of significant improvement. And in a weird way, it is because it is getting worse, because things are getting worse like so quickly. You're seeing relatively quickly like a pretty broad, popular like rejection of the status quo. It's becoming increasingly obvious to like more and more people in this country, and not just in this country, like across the world, that the way things are going is not working, and it's going to make our kids like poorer than us, and maybe like really significantly poorer than us, and people just won't accept that. And I think I think I come from quite a poor background. Then obviously I went to this university and I did a master at Oxford, and now I'm in fancy circles, you could probably tell. And the thing is, like, people in these fancy circles don't see it because they're protected. But at ordinary street level, increasingly everybody knows it's not working. And that means that basically I think like really significant political change in the next 10 years is an inevitability. It will definitely happen in every country, and it is happening in front of our eyes. The problem is, there's a lot of ways that change can happen, and it doesn't have to be positive change. And I think people want something new. And there's a quote by American economist Milton Friedman: at times of crisis, the solution will be chosen from the ideas lying around at the time. And unfortunately, in pretty much every country in the world, we all know what the loudest idea is. It is that the problem is foreigners, the problem is immigrants, and those people are not going to deal with inequality. But there are a lot of people that don't want to vote for anti-foreign, anti-immigrant parties. But unfortunately, nothing is on the table for them. So, I'm trying to build, and it's not just me, and, we're all trying to build, and a lot of other people are trying to build it as well. We're trying to get something else on the table, which is if we reduce inequality, or at the very least stop inequality from increasing, we can make your life better in a material way. And I think we have a chance, because you will see, and I'm very confident, Donald Trump will not improve living standards. And if and when Nigel Farage or other these new right parties getting to power, they will not increase living standards because the problem is inequality and they're all trying to cut taxes for rich people. So I think we will have a really good chance of getting power on this message at some point, but the voice is not loud enough, not enough people are supporting it. We really need a broad unified message. The problem is inequality, that is why you are poor. But you know, you look at the growth of my channel, it's if it keeps growing like that, and that's not just about me, that shows you the level of demand there is, not just in this country, but across the Western world, for a positive voice saying, listen, the reason we are getting poor is because of inequality. Let's stand together and do something about it. So I think I have a chance. I'm going to fight for it. And I'm sure there's more people on this stage and in the audience that will as well.
Thanks, Gary. Good to have some optimism brought into the panel. Fernanda, did you want to come in?
Yes, I want to try and support Gary's point on optimism and bring some on. So what the questions made me think about was, you know, last year, and we put that in the report as setting the context for the extreme offline. Last year, the Kenyan government had a lot of resistance from the public, which was a youth-led resistance that went to the streets, and actually a lot of people died, sadly, fighting against a budget that was going to increase the taxes on ordinary citizens. And, you know, bread, you know, and products that they need on their everyday life. When you have in Kenya as well, you know, like a wealthy elite. And this is happening in South Africa right now. South Africa had an unprecedented budget delay as well, again, because there was more public outrage on the increasing taxes. Now, we have some budgets or spring statements, or I don't know what's going on, but coming up. And there's a lot, you know, of expectation right now that that's what's going to be happening in this country. I would encourage everyone to look at Tax Justice UK, the work of Patriotic Millionaires. You know, there's lots of resources there from the tax justice movement. And this movement is global, and I feel very proud to have engaged with it more and more last year for the G20 in Brazil. And you know, the Brazilian government being so good at putting that issue in the agenda and really fighting for it at the end of that summit. So yeah, and just one more thing that I want to say is two more things. In the US, they're doing a little bit of our job of the extreme wealth line and the harms. We're getting some free advertising for the harms and risks of extreme wealth. So I'd say we should use that because, yeah, I mean, we can't go back in time, but we can try and change what's happening, use what's happening to change for the future. And the final thing I want to say is that, yeah, I mean, I'm very worried, as I'm sure other people are, about the rise of the far right, because it's not just a political party thing, like it's actually an attack on principles that many of us stand for, of equality and justice and fairness and care. And I think that economic policy now really needs to intentively try and tackle that rise. That should be the aim, really, of economic policy, to start to remove that opportunity that has been created by, you know, consecutive governments of different parties, of, you know, poor living standards and just the struggle and the, you know, the massive inequalities that we live in.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go back to the floor now. An absolute sea of hands. Somebody in the middle at the back, please, in a blue top. Middle at the back, yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Timmy. I'm an economics student at
Yeah, go ahead, please. I'm
right,
just saying to the microphone, come over here, please.
economics student at City. Earlier, Ingrid touched on the lack of sustainability for wealth concentration and growth. I was going to ask to everyone, of course, what does that unsustainability look like? Because obviously there's social change happening. We're having conversations like this more, but the ultra rich are going to keep outbidding us for our governments, for our politics. For example, the rise Oh, right, my bad.
You need
hear
to
the-
speak in the microphone.
Did you hear the first part? Do you want me to repeat it?
We heard it, we heard it, we heard it.
Okay, cool. The ultra rich are going to keep outbidding us for our politicians, for example, and they bought some time with the rise of the far right. As social change is taking its time, do you think like maybe we might have to prepare for a hard line, I guess, like a check on their wealth concentration and growth, or do you think social change will be fast enough to help us?
Thanks. Okay, and on the end here, please. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. My name is Victoria and I'm a MSc student of human rights here at LSE. Building off what you guys were saying about like the rise of far right, I wanted to ask that now it seems that the far and alt-right social movement is seemingly dominant, energetic and growing. What do you think tactically they're getting right? What tactics could maybe be appropriated by this movement of advocating against extreme wealth? And how can the social movement be able to dominate instead, basically? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, over here.
Hey, you've talked a lot about using that 250 billion for third world aid. Yet on the flip side of that, as Gary talks about a lot, we're on the trajectory for economic collapse with an ever increasing national debt. Shouldn't that 250 billion be used to pay off national debt first? Because if not, civilization might not even be around in the future to give international aid.
Okay, thank you. So three challenging questions. The first about unsustainability and whether social change will come fast enough. The second about what are the far right getting right in their tactics, and is there anything we can learn from that in a more progressive way? And the third, a challenge about whether we haven't got the money off the billionaires yet, but supposing we were to be able to raise that 250 billion from the tax on billionaires, should we use it better to pay off national debt first? I'll come to my right first, Ingrid.
Yes, I will very briefly answer two questions. The last one on whether the 250 billion should be used for paying off debt. I just think we should then tax billionaires 4% and do both things. No, but I'm serious. The reason is they have an annual return of 7.5 or 8%. They really can afford it. And I really think we have to be careful to play our needs, so of the middle classes and the poor in the global north against those in the global south. Because if you look at data of how the division of the gains from trade have been divided over the last decades between the global south and the global north has given the global south breadcrumbs for what they've done. So I really think there's a huge global justice issue that we've only touched upon here. That was for me because most of what I wrote in my book is about the worst countries, which is the US, but also somewhat in Europe in terms of the wealth concentration, not in terms of the inequality necessarily. But if you look at those statistics, I was shocked to see how so one of the things that neoliberalism did was saying, okay, if we have globalized trade, we will all benefit. It's true. In absolute numbers, we all benefited. But we've given small numbers for the people who work in the sweatshops, do not have protection of minimum incomes like we have here in the global north. So I really think we have our priority should be with getting decent international institutions and also decent trade, and perhaps then we no longer need development aid. So I also think we have to always look at the bigger picture. I'll be very brief on the first question about will social change be fast enough? One of the things that neoliberalism as an ideology has also done is to really constantly try to think of ourselves as economic actors. We are consumers. You are all the students here. You're investors in your human capital. You're no longer having a good time as a young person, because also you have to, of course, take all those loans. So everything becomes financial. And what has been lost is seeing ourselves as citizens. And I think if we regain that aspect of how we look at ourselves, and we do that massively, we can really have the changes that some of the other panelists here have also said are really crucial.
Olivier? I think.
Well, never mind.
Yeah, it's
Okay, that's fine. No, thank you for these questions. I share very much the concerns that are behind the questions, and I'd like to say that the question of what to do in the current context is indeed extremely important. I think there are two questions I'd like to raise in return of the questions we heard. The one is, what do we do with meritocracy? On the one hand, it's an ideal that of equal opportunities that all politicians profess to adhere to. And if we took seriously the idea of equal opportunities, we would do much more to avoid the transmission of privilege and poverty by wealth being transmitted without it being deserved. At the same time, I'm a skeptic about meritocracy in the way it's been used until now, benefiting those who had the privilege of receiving a good education, having the right diplomas from the most prestigious institutions, when many others are extraordinarily resourceful, inventive, talented, but do not have the right paper. And we need to move from meritocracy to diversocracy, if you wish, to allow all these different ways by which people can thrive to be recognized and valued, right? And that is, I think, what we can do, and certainly it is therefore a double-edged sword when we try to oppose meritocracy to the transmission of privilege by the wealthiest to their sons and daughters. The second question I have is about the use of social rights. As you know, there is, for those of you who work on social rights, it's usually said that social rights such as access to health, education, housing, and so on, is subject to progressive realization based on the ability for countries to mobilize the maximum use of available resources. So the idea is you need to create the wealth first, and then you redistribute it to finance social protection, housing, etc. And although that is what the texts say and what the dominant understanding of human rights professes, I am in disagreement with this. I think social rights should be a precondition, an ingredient, and a lever for resources to accrue to those who need it most. And we should put social rights first and then see how then they can be financed, rather than saying we should first build the resources, create the wealth, and then provide this funding. And it's important in that respect to see social rights as a way to help governments arbitrate between conflicting priorities, right? Should we invest in replenishing Westminster or in social housing? Should we invest in public transport or in reducing the cost of fuel? And I think social rights should be a signpost and a guide that we should rely more on, and that is the work of human rights lawyers, who should do more of that work in the world of economics. Finally, on the question of debt, I think it's a huge question because it is because public debt and private debt levels are so high that governments continue to insist on it being an imperative to grow the economy, because without growth, the debt is very costly to pay back for. And as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, as a result of the reactions governments had to the inflation in 2022 resulting from the invasion of Ukraine, the levels of public debt have never been as high. And so governments feel compelled to grow, and that means cutting down on the regulatory burdens on corporations. That means being blackmailed by business enterprises because otherwise there will not be there to deliver growth. And that is, I think, extremely problematic. So to get to escape from the duty to grow at all costs, we need indeed to address this question of public debt. I think it's something not to be underestimated, and we need to work on this, and at the same time recognize that some debts are necessary and an investment for the future. So debt, like growth, needs to be decomposed in its different components, and not all debt is bad.
Thanks very much. So very, very briefly, because we're pretty much out of time. Gary, I thought particularly perhaps on the tactics of the far right, you might have thoughts on.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that. It's something I think about a lot. Talking my own book a little bit here, but like the left is so far behind on social media, like comically, they don't even seem to care. Like I've been around the left for a long time, and I've been screaming at people like, why are you not making videos? Why are you not helping people become influencers? Like that's exactly what the alt-right has been doing for years and years and years, especially in America, and it's so successful. And obviously they have the benefit of being better funded, but there is money going around on the left, and it all seems to be just making 75-page PDFs to send to Rachel. Sorry. Don't get me wrong, we do need a few PDFs, but we also need some videos. We need some videos, and when money does get put to video, it seems to be designed to make videos that people on the left want to see, but you need to be getting views. And I think, I'm only able to do what I do because I could self-fund work for free for 4 or 5 years. But like, we need to look. This is obviously the way politics is going. Online, influencers, videos, TikToks, YouTube, and it's as if we've pretended that hasn't even happened. We need to catch up.
Thanks, Gary, very clear. Fernanda, the final word to you and your 75 page.
Yes, it's not 75, it's a very short report, guys. But I'm not offended, Gary. And in fact, NAF, the New Economics Foundation, does work on writing reports, but also on being out there in communities and organizing, which is the point I want to raise. So yeah, I think one of the harms of extreme wealth is, the impacts on social cohesion and the impact on, all of us basically to maintain the billionaires' billions. We are working sorry, I was about to go there, socks off. We are living, we struggle. A lot of us struggle, and that makes it hard for me to, come here, as I feel quite privileged to work at a think tank. But I know how it is to struggle, and it's not easy just to come up here and say, go out there, engage, politicize. But that's what we need to do. And we need to find ways to work as a society that are not in the minority to support each other to do that better. Because if today maybe I'm struggling, someone else is, going out there and fighting the battle, and then tomorrow I have a bit more energy, then I can do it. But we need to do it collectively, and that's one of the ways that the far right is winning and will continue to win. And so, I really encourage everyone to organize and to check out, of course, the work that NAF is doing around there, because lots of examples of what you mentioned as well, Gary, that needs to happen out there in connecting to the real issues that affecting people in their everyday life.
Thank you very much indeed. So thank you very much, online audience. Thank you to the audience here in the Old Theatre. I'm sorry that not everybody got to ask their question, but there may be a bit of a chance to catch the speakers just at the end here. And I want to finish by just thanking hugely the panel for a very stimulating event, and encouraging us to feel that there are ways in which we as citizens, as Ingrid reminded us, we can think of ourselves not just as consumers and producers, as organisers, as active on social media, on the global stage and international stage as well, that we can make a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.